and this particular lesson day is on government failure. You can remember one of the big things that I'm talking about on this part of the course is that we have the market system, or the price mechanism, then we have market failure, and then the government therefore has to intervene in terms of that market failure, and then on the top of that we have government failure. And there's almost bound to be some government failure within that system, because every good time the government intervenes, there is a question about whether or not the government has made the right intervention or not. Interesting stuff from Anatole Kaletsky, who's written Capitalism 4, and what he says is the government needs to be much stronger in terms of the free market system. However, it also needs to be much smaller, and it needs to sort of give more things to the private sector, but it needs to have a much more tougher regulation on that private sector. Just an interesting thought. Now, the definition of government failure is that the government intervenes in the market, and that creates a misallocation of resources. Very similar definition, obviously, to market failure as well. Now, there are reasons why that occurs. Maybe because there's a lack of information going to the government, and if there's a lack of information, then they're going to make the wrong decisions. I'm going to give an example of that in terms of biofuels over here, which was a really big case of government failure. There's a lack of profit incentive quite clearly in the government sector. So the government's tried to introduce that into the public sector in certain ways, by maybe giving general practitioners, doctors, more power, or by having free schools so they can compete with each other. They tend to be pretty bureaucratic, and they're also subject to political interference. So, for example, the government may decide when they come into election that they're going to spend more money on education, because if you reduce the class size, that obviously means that the educational sector will improve. There are solutions to this. Introduce the profit incentive, introduce free schools, allow them to make profits out of what they do, so therefore schools will start to compete with each other because they want to make a greater profit. We can have competitive tendering, where some of the services can be given to private sector firms, and we can also introduce public-private partnerships where the public and the private sector work together. So the private sector brings in its sort of management, but the public sector will produce programs which are good for the community. Right, so for example, they may decide to build a new road together. The problem with that is that the private company is a private company because it takes a risk, but in a sense the government's taking the risk, but all the profits will actually go to the private company. Okay, but let's have a look at biofuels, and let's have a look at the background, because the background makes sense of why the government made this decision. The biofuels argument was this, that suddenly the price of oil had reached $150 a barrel. America was very afraid about energy security, so therefore decided to go down the biofuel route. And it sounds like a very good thing, doesn't it? Because turning vegetable oil into fuel sounds great, but it's not a finite resource and you can grow it again next year. However, clearly someone hadn't done their homework in terms of it, and vegetable fuel is a very expensive fuel to produce. It's just about okay at $150 a barrel, but when the price of oil fell again, then it became uneconomic. At the same time, food prices were going up, and of course this is an example of composite demand, whereby you are, by producing more ethanol or producing more vegetable oil, there is less land available for the production of food that people can eat. So therefore that was one of the reasons why food prices probably went up. If we look at the UK, right now 40% of our energy, or 38% of our energy, comes from oil needs, probably higher for America, I guess. And for the renewable sector, it's about 12%. So we're still very, very dependent upon oil, as obviously is America from there. Okay, so what happened? Well, what happened was that we had the credit crunch came along and the oil price went down. So therefore, a lot of those factories became uneconomic because they couldn't compete with oil anymore. So there's fundamentally, you were ignoring market forces. Now, if the market forces had the oil going up and up and up, then maybe those factories may have stayed open. Encourages corruption. They give a very good example in the notes that I give you, that they built this great big ethanol factory which had huge subsidies. That was also uneconomic, but it was built upon some of the wrong premises. the owners of that factory told the government a different story about where they were getting all of their fuel from. And every time you have subsidies, people chase a subsidy, a lot of energy chasing the subsidy, rather than thinking how they can produce their good effectively. Food prices went up. Well, food prices partially went up because more land was given over to biofuels. Right, what tends to happen is if the government intervenes in the sector, then that attracts investment towards that sector, and the market system is no longer at work. So that money then is taken away from maybe better projects. In this case, they may well have been better off by spending money on renewable resources. Animal fat, you make money by turning ethanol or animal fat into fuel. So one of them made animal fat, and that was fine at $120 a barrel. Sorry, this really goes back to this first point on here, that $120 a barrel, that was price competitive. But when the price of oil fell, it was no longer competitive, right? And who was to know that suddenly we got shale gas also came along. So shale gas was suddenly a much cheaper alternative to obviously ethanol. And so it's going to put all those firms out of business anyway. But at the time, people didn't really know that shale gas was going to come on the scene. So this was a government decision, but you can understand why they made it when faced with that sort of information. So I think this is the big one at the end though. The government subsidies, right, breed dependence. And then once you become a dependent, you have lobbyists for that industry who will go along and persuade politicians that it's a good idea. In a sense, they're giving them the wrong information because they're making loads of money out of it. So that breeds more subsidies, that breeds more dependence, that breeds more lobbyists. And so the whole story goes on and on and on. Now, so that's why people are always in favour of the market system. Now, I'm a big fan of renewable technology, and I believe that it ought to be subsidised, but hopefully fairly soon there will come a stage when renewable technology is actually cheaper than the conventional forms of energy, and that's when it's really going to take off. And to an extent, I think we're actually quite close to that. Just to give an example, if you insulate your home really well, I think with the energy that you save and the cost that you make, it's actually cheaper than oil. But then you've got to make that effort of improving your home insulation, which is a pain in the neck, and you need the money up front. It maybe cost you £3,000 or £4,000 to do that. And not everybody has £3,000 or £4,000 and they don't really want to spend it on insulating their home. They'd rather take their kids on holiday or something like that. But this brings around to the basic point. If the government or the decision maker is given the wrong information, you're going to end up with government failure. Then what happens is, in a private sector, if you base a decision on the wrong information, you're going to go bust. Now maybe that heightens people's awareness of what to do. But I think this is just an example of actually pouring money into an industry which wasn't really a goer. They would be better off pouring money into the renewable energy sector. And as you may not know, as you'll hear me rant on and on and on, some of the things that make me really angry is that actually I believe that renewable energy is, in terms of price competitiveness, is as cheap as oil, but it depends where you create it. So if you put it on the Sahara Desert and you have a massive investment in there, I actually believe that renewable energy comes in at a lower price than oil. But those are back of the envelope calculations, and I'm no physicist. Okay, but this is an example here, lesson 24, an example of government failure.